My hands are still sticky. Not with blood, thank God, but with cheap hand sanitizer and the residue of what I think was industrial kitchen floor wax. I'm sitting in a police cruiser now, but the fluorescent lights of the supermarket still glare behind my eyelids. I keep seeing the aisle numbers. 8, 9, 10. The ones I couldn't reach. That night was the longest night of my life. Started, of course, with a terrible decision. Black Friday Eve. It was 10:30 p.m. on Thanksgiving night. The full-bellied exhaustion of the holiday had settled over the entire town of Willow Creek. My daughter, Chloe, a freshman in college, had called earlier, frantic. "Mom, I need that new laptop for my coding class. The sale ends at midnight, and it's only available in-store. Can you please get it?" I was already in my pajamas, ready for bed. My husband, David, was asleep on the couch, snoring softly, a mashed potato coma victim. I hated the thought of driving 30 minutes to the huge, brightly lit megamart, but I couldn't say no to Chloe. She was working so hard. "Fine, honey," I whispered into the phone. "But if I get trampled by an early bird shopper, you're paying for my funeral." I bundled up, grabbed my wallet, and headed out. The drive was deserted. Eerily so. When I pulled into the megamart parking lot, the scene was bizarre. There were maybe 6 cars scattered across the massive concrete field. No lines, no crowds, no frantic energy. The massive store sign was half dark, blinking unevenly. I walked inside. It was worse than empty. It was hollow. The usual loud pop music was off. There was just the low, humming fluorescent lights and the sound of my own sneakers squeaking on the polished floor. A teenager, clearly miserable, was working the sole open register. "Welcome to Megamart. We're open until 1 a.m. "Happy Thanksgiving," he recited, sounding dead inside. I found the electronics section. The laptop I needed was there, waiting on the shelf. I grabbed it. Easy. Too easy. I checked my phone. 11:15 p.m. I was relieved. I could be home soon. As I headed back toward the front, I passed the back aisle, which housed seasonal goods, the remaining ghosts of Halloween mixed with early Christmas decorations. I saw a flicker of movement down near the sporting goods entrance. Someone was there. It wasn't a shopper. It was a man, large and bulky, wearing a heavy, dark puffer coat with the hood pulled up. He was wrestling with a large, industrial-sized chain. He seemed to be hooking it around the sliding glass door of the sporting goods entrance, pulling it tight. Why would he be locking a door from the inside? I immediately felt a cold spike of fear. This wasn't right. I froze, pulling the laptop box against my chest. I watched, terrified, as he finished securing the chain, then looked slowly around the empty aisle. His face was still concealed by the hood. I backed up silently, turning toward the center aisle, but my foot slipped, and the laptop box grazed a stack of ceramic vases, sending a small clack echoing through the huge, silent store. The man's head snapped up. He looked directly down the aisle. He hadn't seen me, but he had heard me. I started walking quickly toward the front registers. Fast, but trying not to run. "Don't run, don't panic. Sir, you can't go that way. The store is closing soon." I called out, my voice weak and shaking. I was trying to sound authoritative. He didn't answer. He just started walking. Towards me. Slow, deliberate steps. I broke into a sprint. I ran past the frozen foods, past the towering stacks of soda boxes, the poor cashier kid at the front. He was my only chance. Hey, I need to check out now. Call security. Call the police. I yelled, barreling toward the single open lane. The cashier looked up, his eyes widening in confusion and then terror. "Ma'am, what's wrong?" "There's no security." Before he could finish the sentence, the large man emerged from the end of the aisle. He wasn't running. but he was closing the distance faster than I thought possible. And now I saw what he was carrying in his gloved hand. It was a heavy, dull-looking metal object, maybe a crowbar. I threw the laptop box onto the conveyor belt. "Run! Get out! Back door! Now!" I screamed at the cashier. The man raised the crowbar. I braced myself for the impact, not sure if it was meant for me or the cashier. Instead, he swung down, not at us, but at the main electrical panel right next to the checkout desk. There was a sickening electric crack, a brief flash of blue light, and the entire megamart went plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness. I gasped. The darkness swallowed all sound, except for the high-pitched whine of the store's massive freezer units dying down. I heard the cashier shriek. "The back door! My locker! It's unlocked!" I didn't wait. I scrambled over the counter, cutting my hand on the metal edge of the register. The darkness was total. I had no idea where the man was, or where the cashier went. Did he follow the kid, or did he stay near the panel? I dropped to my hands and knees, crawling behind the customer service kiosk. I tried to remember the store layout. The employee exit was near the pharmacy. But first, I needed a phone. My own phone was in my jacket pocket, useless without a signal, and the battery was low. I heard a heavy thump somewhere down the main aisle. He was moving. I held my breath, listening for the direction. Then, I heard something else. A low, rhythmic dragging sound. Scrape, scrape. It sounded like the metal tool he was carrying was being dragged along the floor, acting as a terrifying locator beacon. I had to get away from the front. I crawled quickly, keeping low, moving into the main aisle, using the high, massive shelving units for cover. I headed toward the back storage areas. As I reached the cleaning supplies aisle, I heard the dragging stop. Silence again. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might deafen me. Did he know I was here? Was he waiting? I crept around the corner. And there he was, standing stock still, maybe 20 feet away. He was staring straight ahead, his dark silhouette almost invisible against the blackness. He wasn't moving. He was listening. I needed a distraction. Something loud. I reached up slowly, my fingers brushing against the plastic wrapper of a massive stack of 48-roll toilet paper. I gave it a slight push. The huge stack wobbled, then tumbled, releasing a cacophony of soft, bouncing rolls that hit the floor with dull, distracting thuds. Thump, thump, thump. The man instantly turned toward the noise. He started walking in that direction. I used the opportunity. I bolted in the opposite direction, toward the back of the store, the loading docks. I didn't care about noise anymore. I was running flat out, weaving through the deserted aisles. I found the double doors leading to the loading bay. They were heavy steel. I tried the push bar. Locked, secured from the outside, probably with another chain. My last hope crumbled. I sank against the cold metal, tears of pure terror welling up. I was trapped, a huge, lightless steel cage. Then I heard him call out. His voice was a flat monotone, echoing off the metal walls. "I know you're back there, ma'am. I just need to collect the night's earnings. Are you helping me? Or are you going to be a complication? It's a holiday, remember? We should be thankful for what we have." He was a robber, a crazed, axe-wielding, Black Friday Eve robber. But why was he locking all the doors? As his footsteps approached, heavy and slow, I saw a sliver of light. It was coming from a small service door, usually marked employees only, compactor access. It was maybe 20 feet away, near the garbage bins. I sprinted toward it. I grabbed the handle. It was slick with something cold. I twisted. Locked. No, wait. It was just stiff. I pulled using all my weight. The door flew open with a screech of rusty hinges. The outside air hit my face. Cold, fresh, and slightly smelling of rotting food. Freedom. But before I could step through, A massive hand grabbed my shoulder, dragging me back into the dark room. The crowbar clanged against the metal doorframe. He held me tight, breathing heavily. "I told you to be thankful. Now you're being selfish." I clawed at his hand, desperate. My fingers found the sharp, jagged edge of the metal doorframe where the crowbar had struck. I dragged his hand across the edge with all my strength. He gasped, a sharp cry of pain. He released me instantly. I didn't hesitate. I threw myself through the service door and slammed it shut, pulling the small, exterior emergency handle to secure the bolt. It might only hold for seconds, but it was enough. I was in a small, fenced-in area with a massive dumpster. I looked up. Above the dumpster, the chain-link fence topped with barbed wire was maybe 8 feet high. Impossible. But then I saw it. The huge industrial dumpster was overflowing. Its lid was slightly ajar. I scrambled onto the bin, using the piled-up cardboard boxes as steps. The stench was horrific, but I didn't care. I reached the top. I could hear the man slamming his body against the flimsy service door behind me. Boom! Boom! I climbed onto the narrow lip of the dumpster, gripping the barbed wire. My jacket caught, tearing a long strip, but I didn't look back. I vaulted myself over the fence, landing hard on the wet, frozen asphalt outside the compound. I was bleeding, covered in grime, and shaking uncontrollably, but I was out. I ran across the dark parking lot, found my car, and drove away, not stopping until I saw the first city lights on the highway. The cashier, they found him later. He had run to his locker, where he'd hidden his keys, and had managed to get out through a side utility closet before the man could find him. We were the lucky ones. The reason I'm taping this interview is because if I stop talking, he wins. And I don't mean that in a metaphorical getting through a tough moment way. I mean, he'll actually walk back in, and I won't be alive to see sunrise. The last time I saw a reflection of my face, it looked like chalk. I'm sitting here in a walk-in pantry that smells overwhelmingly like stale cinnamon and forgotten pumpkin spice. It's Black Friday, though it feels more like a wake. I hear the faintest sound of wind chimes outside the heavily boarded-up window in the kitchen. He hates that sound. I should have paid more attention to the weather forecast. Everyone always talks about the perfect, golden, autumnal haze of Thanksgiving. This year, it was just gray and bitter. My husband, Mark, and I decided to skip the long drive to my in-laws this year, choosing instead to have a quiet, perfect, 2-person meal in our newly renovated cabin outside of Oakhaven. We splurged on the heritage turkey, the kind that costs more than a week's groceries, and bought too many bottles of fancy wine. It was supposed to be idyllic. A reset. The day was fine, honestly. Just fine. We cooked, we ate too much, and we were asleep by 9. That's the kind of excitement a couple pushing 40 needs, right? It was still dark when I woke up, maybe 1 a.m. The wind had picked up, and it was rattling the big picture window in the living room. I nudged Mark. "Honey, did you lock the basement door? I keep hearing something. It sounds like metal." He mumbled something unintelligible about the gravy being too thick and rolled over. I sighed. This was my new reality. Mark could sleep through an air raid siren. I, on the other hand, was now wide awake. The noise wasn't just the wind. It was distinct. A rhythmic clink-scrape, like someone was dragging a heavy chain across the patio. Our cabin is remote. The nearest neighbor is almost a mile through dense woods. Who would be outside at 1 a.m. on a freezing night? And what were they dragging? I slid out of bed, pulling on Mark's oversized fleece. The hardwood floor was ice cold. I crept to the kitchen, peering through the small window above the sink. The motion sensor light over the garage flickered on, bathing a corner of the driveway in harsh white. I saw it. Or rather, I saw a shadow move fast. Too fast. A large silhouette, maybe 6 feet tall, built thick. It wasn't dragging a chain. It was carrying something. something long and awkwardly shaped. It looked like an old, heavy wooden sign, maybe, or a massive fence post. And then the shadow stopped right by our back deck, and I heard the sound again. Only this time it was closer. A deep, guttural thud. What was that awful noise? Did they just drop whatever they were carrying? I rushed back to the bedroom, shaking Mark harder this time. "Mark, wake up. There's someone outside. I think they're trying to break in." He finally jolted awake, blinking confusedly. "What? Jess? Stop. It's probably just a deer. Deer don't carry things, Mark. Go look. Please. Call the police." He grabbed his phone, but the screen was dark. "Power's out, honey. Must be the storm. We're fine. Go back to sleep." But the sound I heard next wasn't the wind, or a deer, or a power outage. It was the unmistakable crunch of shattered glass coming from the living room, the big picture window. Mark's eyes finally went wide with terror. He didn't say a word. He just grabbed my arm and dragged me toward the hallway leading to the back door. We had planned for this theoretically. The emergency kit was in the mudroom. The spare key, my purse. "We're taking the Jeep," he whispered, his voice shaking. We scrambled into the mudroom. The back door lock was a cheap deadbolt. Mark fumbled with the keys. My hands were useless, my whole body vibrating with adrenaline. And then, a sound that stopped my heart entirely. It wasn't the smash of glass this time. It was slow, deliberate footsteps on the hardwood. They were already inside. Mark swore under his breath. "The shed. Hurry. We can hide in the shed." I forgot to lock it. The shed was a stupid idea. It was a fiberglass box full of rusty lawn tools. But it was closer than the Jeep. We burst out the back door into the freezing air. The grass was wet and slick. We ran about 20 feet, plunging into the darkness behind the cabin. As Mark wrestled with the shed latch, I looked back. The motion light was still on, casting that awful pallor over the scene. I saw him clearly now. He wasn't a shadow. He was a man in dark overalls and a heavy, dirty canvas jacket. He had something covering his face, a dark ski mask or something similar, and he was holding a heavy, wooden-handled axe. But that wasn't the terrifying part. The terrifying part was that he wasn't looking at the front door or the kitchen. He was standing in the middle of our living room, next to the Christmas tree we had already set up, and he was staring directly at the back door we had just used. He knew where we were going. He must have been watching us for a long time. "Mark," he saw us. "He's right there." I hissed. Mark finally yanked the shed door open and shoved me inside. "Get in. Stay quiet. Don't move." He slammed the flimsy door shut. The lock was just a simple latch. No real security. We huddled amongst the shovels and bags of potting soil. It smelled earthy and metallic. We could hear his slow, heavy approach. Crunch, crunch, crunch on the gravel outside the shed. The footsteps stopped right outside. Silence. An absolute, suffocating silence broken only by my ragged breathing. I pressed my back against a cold, sharp rake handle. Then came a sound that haunts my nightmares. It wasn't a violent slam. It was a light, almost polite tap, tap, tap on the thin fiberglass door, like he was waiting for me to answer. "Don't worry," a voice whispered from inches away, muffled but clear. It was low, gravelly, and disturbingly calm. "I know you're celebrating. It's a special day. I just need to collect a few things. Collect a few things." What did he mean? Was he just a crazy burglar who came prepared with an axe? Why the politeness? "I saw the menu you left out on the counter, Jessica," he continued, and my stomach dropped. He knew my name. "You put a lot of effort into that heritage bird. It would be a shame to let it go to waste. It's going to be a long winter." He wasn't collecting things. He was collecting us. Mark silently reached out and grabbed a rusty trowel. It was pathetic. His hand was trembling so hard I thought he'd drop it. I shook my head violently, trying to warn him off. Violence wasn't the answer here. He was armed and completely prepared. "I'm going to step away now. Give you a minute to consider your options," the voice said. The cadence was eerie. It sounded like a father giving instructions to a child. "I'll be waiting in the main house. Don't try to leave the property." I already secured the perimeter. The crunching footsteps retreated. I waited for 5 full minutes, counting every second. The air in the shed was thin and tasted of dust. "We have to run," Mark whispered, panic tightening his throat. "While he's inside, we run to the woods." "No." He said he secured the perimeter. "He's waiting for us to make a move. We need to call for help. We need to find a way to signal someone." The closest house was too far. Our phones were useless. We were trapped. Mark ignored me. His fear had devolved into sheer recklessness. He yanked open the shed door. "Stay here if you want." "I'm going." I grabbed his sleeve. "Mark, don't. Wait for the sun." He wrenched his arm away. He took 3 steps out into the darkness and then froze. He was staring down at the ground. I craned my neck to see past him. Right where he had been standing, there was the thing I had seen the shadow carrying earlier. It wasn't a fence post. It was a heavy, old-fashioned wooden sign, and it had been pounded deep into the damp earth. Scrawled across it in what looked terrifyingly like dried blood were 3 words: "Property of Thanksgiving," and hanging from the post, tied with thick twine, was my house key, the one I kept on my keyring. The one Mark thought he was fumbling for at the back door. He hadn't needed to smash the window. He was playing with us. Before Mark could process what he was seeing, I heard a wet, sickening thwack. It came from the direction of the house. Mark's body shuddered and then slowly crumpled to the ground, disappearing behind the shed door. He hadn't been waiting in the house. He had been right there watching the shed, waiting for the inevitable escape attempt, waiting for Mark. I didn't scream. Couldn't. I slammed the shed door shut again, shoving a heavy old sack of concrete mix against the flimsy wood. I was trembling so violently I almost passed out. I could hear the slow, deliberate footsteps coming back toward the shed. They stopped right outside. No more tapping. "Now you're alone, Jessica. You were supposed to be my appetizer, but your husband insisted on going first." The voice was calm, almost disappointed. "I left the turkey out. It's getting cold. Come inside. We can still salvage the day." I scrambled over the tools, desperately searching for anything I could use. A rusty spade, a long, sharp pitchfork. Nothing felt adequate. I crawled into the darkest corner, behind a stack of empty paint cans. The latch rattled violently. He was pulling. He was testing the strength of the door against the sack of concrete. The thin wood groaned under the pressure. "I have all night, you know? It's a holiday. Nobody is going to miss the noise. Nobody is coming to check on you. Are you curious about what I'll do when I get in?" "I am." He pulled again. The door buckled. I could see a sliver of darkness where the wood had splintered near the top hinge. I held the pitchfork up uselessly. I knew I couldn't stay in the shed. I had to get back to the house. The house was locked. The doors were sturdier. Maybe I could still call someone from a landline or find another way out. It was illogical, but sitting in the shed was signing my death warrant. With a final, desperate surge of courage, I lunged forward and shoved the pitchfork into the crack in the door. Not to hurt him, but to wedge the door shut, giving me a second. I used that precious second to sprint to the other side of the shed. I kicked out the bottom corner panel. The fiberglass was surprisingly brittle, and squeezed my body out into the dark, freezing yard. I didn't look back. I ran low, sticking to the shadow of the cabin, toward the house. I made it to the kitchen door, fumbling with the spare key I knew was useless. But then I remembered. The picture window. It was smashed. It was an entry point. I crawled through the shattered remains of the living room window, wincing as glass shards scraped my jacket. I was back inside. The silence of the house was more unnerving than the noise outside. The kitchen was dark. I moved quickly, feeling along the counter for the landline. I found it. I lifted the receiver. Dead. He had cut the main line. I heard the shed door finally splintering and tearing. He was free. He would be back inside in minutes. I needed a better hiding place. The pantry. Small, no windows, solid door. I slammed myself inside, locking the small bolt. I moved the heavy jars of preserves and the turkey baster set against the door for extra measure. Now I'm here, taping this interview or maybe just a final message on my phone. I only have 10% battery left. I can hear him now. He's moving around the house. Slow, deliberate. He knows I'm in here. I hear the squeak of the floorboards right outside the pantry door. He's here. What is he doing? Why isn't he breaking the door down immediately? He just stopped. I hear a soft, metallic scraping sound. He's sharpening the axe. I can smell the iron. I should have gone to my in-laws. Why did we ever think a quiet Thanksgiving was a good idea? I wish I could trade this moment for the thickest, blandest gravy in the world. He's waiting. He's listening for my breath to hitch. I can hear him humming now. A low, simple tune. It sounds like a hymn. Or maybe a lullaby. How long will he keep me here? What is he planning to do once he gets in? I can see the clock on my phone.
2:47 a.m.
The sun won't rise for hours. The wind chimes are quiet now. The silence is absolute. Story 3. The smell of stale coffee and desperation is the smell of Thanksgiving travel. I was huddled on a hard plastic chair in the Omaha airport, staring at the screen that confirmed my fate. Flight 419 to Chicago. Canceled. Severe winter storm warning. It was 9 p.m. on Thursday, Thanksgiving night. I was supposed to be halfway to my sister's house in Michigan, carving the late turkey. Instead, I was 2 states away, the airport was emptying out, and the snow outside was coming down in thick, blinding sheets. I was stranded, alone. I called every rental car company, all closed, all vehicles gone. I checked the rideshare apps. Nothing. The roads were too bad. Panic started to tighten my chest. Where would I sleep? How would I get home? That's when he showed up. He was older, maybe 60, with kind, crinkly eyes and a big, friendly grin. He wore a flannel shirt and a baseball cap that said, Nebraska Cornhuskers. He looked like every kindly uncle you've ever ignored at a family dinner. Rough night. Huh, sweetie. Long holiday drives are a real killer, he said, pulling up a chair next to mine. I nodded, feeling immediate, desperate relief at seeing a friendly face. He told me he was driving his old Ford F-150 from Denver all the way to Iowa to drop off some furniture for his daughter. Just passing through, he chuckled. But if you're heading east, I'm taking the old state road through. Might get you closer to your connection if the main interstate is closed. I hesitated for maybe 3 seconds. Accepting a ride from a complete stranger on a deserted holiday night felt insane. But the alternative was sleeping on the floor of a ghost airport, missing Friday's flight, and spending the entire holiday alone. I'm heading toward Chicago. If you could get me to a town with a decent hotel, that would be a lifesaver, I said. Ed smiled and slapped his knee. Done and done. I could use the company. You remind me of my niece, actually. Let's get out of this zoo. We walked out into the biting cold. His truck was huge and old, smelling strongly of wood smoke and mothballs. He helped me hoist my suitcase into the back. As we pulled out of the parking lot, I felt a wave of guilt and self-recrimination. What was I doing? Was this just desperation or pure stupidity? The first hour was fine. He talked about his grandkids, the terrible corn yield this year, and how holiday travel was a racket. It was boring, normal conversation. I started to relax. This was just a good Samaritan. Then, Ed turned off the well-maintained state highway onto a small, unpaved road. The snow was heavy here, and the truck rattled over deep ruts. "Where are we going, Ed? I thought you were sticking to the main route," I asked, gripping the armrest. "Oh, just a little detour. My route takes me past this old gas station, Jake's Pit Stop. I always stop there on my way through. Best slice of pecan pie you'll ever have, even on Thanksgiving." "It's a real tradition," he explained, his eyes fixed straight ahead. "Ed, I really don't need pie. I just need to get to a lighted highway." He chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "Nonsense. It's Thanksgiving. You can't skip dessert. Besides, I could use the restroom, and Jake's is the only place open for 60 miles. My stomach twisted. We hadn't passed a single other car since we left the state road. The only thing visible was the truck's headlights illuminating the falling snow. It was pitch black outside the cab. "But you said it was a long drive for you. You must be tired. Why not stop at the next town?" I pressed. He sighed, a heavy, impatient sound. "Look, I'm taking you this far. You can handle a 5-minute stop. We'll be in the next town before midnight. Trust me." The word trust felt like a threat. I didn't. I noticed his hands on the steering wheel. They weren't the hands of a kindly grandfather. They were thick, scarred, and his knuckles were unnaturally white. He was gripping the wheel with extreme force. After what felt like an hour, we saw it. A single, sickly orange light in the distance. Jake's Pit Stop. It wasn't a modern gas station. It was a shack. A single pump island, a broken-down diner sign that read ATS. And the main building was dark except for that awful orange porch light. Ed pulled the truck right up to the front door. He turned the engine off. The sudden silence was deafening. "All right, I'll just be a minute. Don't you go anywhere now. Stay right here," he said, but the pleasantness was gone from his voice. It was hard, and there was an edge of command I hadn't heard before. He opened his door and stepped out into the blizzard. I watched him walk to the main door of the shack. It was locked. He didn't knock. He just reached under the floor mat and pulled out a key. If he's just a passerby, why does he have a key to the place? He disappeared inside. I had to move. This was the moment. He wasn't stopping for pie. He was isolating me. I didn't know what was inside that dark shack, but I didn't want to find out. I reached for the door handle. Locked. Child safety locks. Panic flooded me. Think, Jessica. Think. I frantically searched the passenger side. I found a small compartment beneath the seat. It held a greasy map, a plastic cup, and a huge, rusted flashlight. Heavy. I heard the door of the shack creak open. Ed was coming back. I quickly slipped the flashlight beneath my jacket. I had no time to unlock the door. He got back into the truck. He didn't look at me. He just sat there, breathing heavily, and pulled something out of his pocket. It was a small roll of heavy-duty duct tape. "You didn't stay put. That's disappointing," he said quietly, his voice now entirely stripped of its earlier charm. "We're going to have to make a slight adjustment to the seating arrangement. Can't have you wandering around. It's dangerous out here." I kept my hands in my lap, trying to appear defeated. "Where are we going, Ed? What's going on?" I asked, trying to sound scared but compliant. He started peeling a strip of the tape, making a loud, sickening tearing sound. "We're heading back to my place, just off the main road. Nobody bothers me out there. We're having our own little Thanksgiving dinner. I have the most wonderful turkey leftovers. You'll be the guest of honor." He reached across the seat toward my hands. I knew this was my only chance. I lunged forward, not at him, but at the gear shift. I slammed it into neutral. Then, I grabbed the heavy flashlight from under my jacket and swung it blindly at the dashboard, aiming for the keys. I missed the keys, but the heavy glass of the main console screen shattered with a loud crack. The distraction was enough. Ed roared in frustration. He grabbed my arm, his grip like steel. "You idiot. You just made this harder." I screamed and used my free hand to blindly reach for the door handle again. I yanked it, remembering the child lock. Useless. I kicked out, connecting with his side. He grunted and leaned away for a second. That was all I needed. I pulled the rusted flashlight back. With everything I had, I smashed it against the passenger window. The thick glass spiderwebbed but didn't break. I smashed it again. Harder. I felt the edge of the flashlight cut into my hand. The window exploded outward in a spray of glittering safety glass and ice-cold wind. Ed screamed, not in pain, but in rage. "Get back here. You can't run in this storm. You'll freeze." I didn't listen. I threw myself across the seat, scrambling through the shattered opening. The snow hit my face like needles. I landed hard on the slushy ground next to the pump. I stumbled to my feet, ignoring the searing pain in my palms from the glass. Ed was scrambling out of his side of the truck. I ran blindly around the front of the truck and toward the dark shack. I knew I couldn't outrun him in the open. I needed cover. I reached the front door, the one he had just opened with the key. I jammed my shoulder against it. Locked again. I looked wildly around. Next to the door was a low, recessed window, probably for the restroom. It was covered by a weak security grate. I grabbed the heavy metal pump nozzle from the gas island. It was slippery and cold. I didn't have time to process the danger. I swung the nozzle like a mace and smashed it against the small window, then the grate. The weak grate popped off its hinges with a horrible scraping noise. The glass shattered instantly. I heard Ed's heavy, desperate footsteps closing in on the gravel behind me. "Come out, girl. I'm right behind you. It's too cold." I threw the nozzle aside and squeezed myself through the narrow, shattered window frame. I landed inside a small, dark room, smelling overwhelmingly of ammonia and damp paper towels. The restroom. I locked the door to the restroom with the flimsy thumb-turn lock. It would hold for maybe a second. I looked for another way out. High on the wall, there was a small, grimy ventilation fan. Too small. I heard Ed slamming against the main restroom door. I didn't wait for him to splinter the wood. I grabbed the only heavy object I could find, the large porcelain tank lid from the toilet. I yanked it up. It was awkward and heavy. I then smashed the tank lid against the wall where the small fan was mounted. The plaster crumbled, expanding the opening by just a few crucial inches. I clawed at the broken edges, ignoring the scrapes and cuts. I pulled myself into the narrow opening. It was tight. So tight I thought I would get stuck, an awful, terrifying thought. I pushed with my feet against the toilet below, squeezing my shoulders through the gap. Finally, I popped out onto the frigid roof. The snow was still coming down, but I had a clear view of the area. I saw the snowmobile trail marker posts in the field behind the shack. I jumped down from the roof onto a pile of old tires, then bolted for the tree line. I ran along the faint snowmobile track. I ran until my lungs burned and I couldn't feel my feet. I ran until I saw the blessed sight of the main state road, where an early morning snowplow was moving slowly. I staggered onto the road, waving my bloody hands in the beam of the plow's lights. The driver slammed on his brakes. He wrapped me in a blanket and called the state police. Ed was gone when they finally arrived at the gas station. They found his truck, abandoned, with the passenger door open. They found the roll of duct tape, but they didn't find the pie. They found a heavy hunting knife tucked into his glove compartment. Story 4. I still don't know why I went. Maybe it was the letterhead. Heavy, cream-colored paper with a raised seal that simply read, "The Blackwood Estate." Maybe it was the promise of a distant inheritance or just the sheer curiosity of meeting a great-aunt I never knew existed. The invitation was simple: join us for the annual Thanksgiving feast, a tradition vital to the continuance of our line. It felt like a formality, a quiet test. I was broke and alone for the holiday, so I said yes. The estate was 2 hours past the last town, hidden at the end of a winding, muddy road lined with skeletal, bare trees. As I approached the manor, my first impression was of staggering wealth and crushing decay. The house was massive, Victorian Gothic, with turrets and gables and black, grimy windows. The grounds were overgrown. It looked less like a home and more like a mausoleum. Great Aunt Alara met me at the door. She was ancient, tiny, and frighteningly composed. She wore a dress made of heavy black velvet and a single, enormous ruby pendant. Her handshake was like touching cold porcelain. "Welcome, Liam. I had hoped you would come. The lineage requires sustenance," she said, her voice thin but sharp. Her eyes, pale blue and magnified by thick glasses, held no warmth whatsoever. The inside of the house was opulent but freezing. Massive oil paintings of grim-faced ancestors stared down at me. The air smelled of wood polish, dust, and something metallic, like old pennies. The other guests were already gathered in the vast dining room. There were 5 of them. They were all distant cousins, none of whom I had ever met. They looked like me. Same tall build, same fair hair, but their eyes were flat and vacant. They sat quietly around the massive mahogany table, hands folded in their laps, staring at the empty plates. No one spoke. No one smiled. "They are awaiting the main event," Aunt Alara explained, ushering me to a seat. "It is customary to begin the day with gratitude. Then comes the true feast." The gratitude part consisted of her reading a long, droning history of the Blackwood family, detailing all the sacrifices they had made to preserve the integrity of the line. She spoke of long winters, unforgiving debts, and necessary actions. It was unnerving, but I chalked it up to aristocratic eccentricity. The dinner service began around 7 p.m. The food was incredible. A huge, golden brown turkey, glazed ham, and every side dish imaginable. The cousins ate politely in silence. I tried to engage them in conversation about their jobs, the drive, but I only received vague, almost monosyllabic answers. It was like speaking to very well-dressed ghosts. Were they hypnotized? Or just terribly shy? As I finished my second glass of wine, Aunt Alara stood up. The scraping of her chair was the loudest noise of the night. "Now the tradition," she announced, her voice gaining an unexpected, frightening strength. "Every Thanksgiving, we honor the ancestor who ensures our future. We will now proceed to the library for the reading of the covenant. You, dear Liam, as the newest arrival, must be present." She led us out of the dining room. As we walked past the kitchen, I glanced in. A hulking man in a blood-stained butcher's apron was scrubbing a cleaver at the stainless steel sink. He stopped and looked up. His gaze was utterly cold. My stomach clenched. The library was at the very end of the longest corridor. It was dark, lined floor to ceiling with books I couldn't read. In the center was a small, dusty lectern and a single, heavy, leather-bound book. Aunt Alara opened the book to a marked page. She began to read a passage in a Latin I didn't understand. Then she switched to English, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The covenant demands purity. The line must be preserved from contamination. And so, every year a life is invested back into the lineage. A necessary debt." She paused, looking directly at me. Her pale eyes seemed to pierce right through me. "You see, Liam, not every invitation is merely for dinner. We require fresh stock to replenish the aging gene pool. You have the purity, the strength." The terror hit me like a physical blow. I looked at the cousins. They were now blocking the door. Their flat, dead eyes held no pity. They weren't family. They were complicit. Or maybe they were just waiting their turn. Wait, you're saying, this isn't just about a will? I stammered. It is precisely about the will, darling, she simpered. The will of the ancestors. They require a sacrifice to ensure the rest of us thrive. And you, my dear boy, are the one we have chosen to be thankful for. I took a step back, knocking over a stack of obscure old scrolls. I used the noise as cover and bolted toward the French doors leading to the garden. Locked. Heavy iron bolts. The hulking man from the kitchen, I assumed he was the butcher, appeared silently in the doorway, blocking my only way back into the hall. He was holding the cleaver. Don't worry, dear. It's a quick, clean process. Very traditional, Aunt Alara cooed, stepping toward me with surprising speed. I scrambled behind the lectern, grabbing the heavy, leather-bound covenant book. I hurled it at the butcher's head. It hit him squarely. He staggered back, momentarily stunned. I didn't wait. I ran deeper into the library, searching the shelves desperately. I remembered seeing a hinge on a bookcase earlier. I pulled a heavy volume of philosophy, The Ethics of Life and Death, and the entire section of books swung inward, revealing a pitch-black passage. A secret stairway. I dove into the hole, pulling the shelf shut behind me. The darkness was absolute. I could hear Aunt Alara shrieking in the library. He's escaping. Find him. The harvest cannot be spoiled. I fumbled for my phone. Dead. The cabin fever and isolation must have drained the signal and battery. I started descending the stone steps. The air grew heavy and cold, smelling of damp earth and something acrid. Where was this going? Was I running deeper into the trap? The stairs ended in a low-ceilinged stone chamber. The walls were slimy with condensation. I saw cages, iron cages like something from a medieval prison. And inside, figures were huddled. They weren't family. They were victims. Their eyes were wide with terror, their clothes ragged. They were gaunt, thin, and stared at me with silent, pleading desperation. They're the failures, a chilling voice whispered from the darkness. I spun around. Aunt Alara stood there, her face contorted with insane rage. She wasn't carrying a weapon. She was holding a single, small silver locket. You found the nursery. These are the ones who failed the test. Too weak, too impure. We keep them until they are needed. She lunged at me. Her strength was shocking. She clawed at my face, her sharp, bony fingers tearing at my cheek. I shoved her away. She stumbled backward, hitting her head hard on the stone floor. She didn't move. I ran past her still body, toward the only other exit I saw, a heavy, wooden cellar door at the far end of the chamber. I didn't know what was behind it, but it had to be better than this tomb. I slammed my shoulder into the door. The wood was old and weak. It burst open into a narrow, muddy tunnel, a root cellar. I scrambled through the tunnel, pushing past rotting potatoes and moldy jars. I could hear heavy, panicked footsteps now from above. The butcher and the cousins were descending the stairs. I reached the end of the tunnel. It opened onto a small chain door, half buried beneath the soil. I pushed desperately. It groaned. The chain was locked. How could I break a heavy chain without light or tools? I felt frantically around the muddy ground. My hand closed around a small, sharp piece of rusted metal, part of a shovel blade. I wedged the metal into the weak, rusted link of the chain near the padlock. I twisted it, grunting with effort. The metal dug into my palm. I heard the voices of the cousins echoing down the tunnel, getting closer. He's there. Get him. I gave one final, desperate twist. The rusted link snapped with a small, brittle ping. I yanked the chain free and shoved the cellar door open. I burst out into the night air. It was snowing lightly. I was in the middle of a dense, dark grove of trees behind the manor. I ran, I ran through the trees, not looking back, running until I crashed through the final line of foliage and stumbled onto the muddy, deserted road. I didn't stop until I saw the yellow gleam of a distant farm light. I flagged down a logging truck hours later. I was freezing, bleeding, and covered in mud. I told the police everything. They didn't find Aunt Alara. They found the manor empty, but they found the cages. I still wonder what happened to the other guests. Story 5. I thought I was doing something good. That's the most haunting part of the whole night. Every Thanksgiving, I volunteer at the city's largest soup kitchen, St. Jude's. It's a hectic, hot, and messy 12-hour shift, but it feels like the one genuinely meaningful thing I do all year. This year, the weather was brutally cold, so the crowds were heavier and more desperate than usual. We served over 1,000 meals. By 10 p.m., the dining hall was finally quiet. I was exhausted, aching, and ready to go home. I was on cleanup duty, scrubbing massive steel pots in the industrial kitchen. The head volunteer, Mrs. Henderson, was locking up the front doors, and the remaining staff were in the back office counting donations. I was alone in the large, echoing kitchen. As I was scraping the final pot of hardened gravy, a man slipped in through the back delivery entrance. He was soaking wet from the freezing rain, wearing a thin, patched-up coat and a beanie pulled low over his eyes. He looked frantic, not hungry. Sir, we're closed. The meal service ended hours ago, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. He ignored me. He moved quickly, his eyes scanning the room with terrifying intensity. He wasn't looking for food. He was looking for someone. Please. I know. I just need 5 minutes in the restroom. Please. They're right outside, he whispered, his voice hoarse and raw. His hands were trembling, but they weren't held out in supplication. They were clenched into fists. Who's outside? The police. We can call them, I offered, taking a step back toward the main kitchen door. He shook his head violently. No cops. Not cops. They'll find me. They're the ones looking. Just let me hide. As he stepped fully into the light, I got a clearer look at his face. It was pale and drawn, covered in a week's growth of beard, and there was a long, dark scar that ran from his temple down to his jaw. It wasn't the face of a man looking for a meal. It was the face on a wanted poster. I remembered seeing a brief news report this morning, buried beneath the Thanksgiving parade coverage. A highly dangerous fugitive had escaped from a transport bus during the snowstorm. He was known for violence. His name, something like Silas or Simon. He saw the recognition flicker in my eyes. He stopped his movement toward the restroom and looked straight at me. His eyes narrowed. You recognize me, don't you? He stated, not asked. He took a slow, deliberate step toward the long counter that separated us. I pressed myself against the stainless steel sink. I don't know what you're talking about. I'm just closing up. Don't lie. The whole country saw my picture this morning. It's Thanksgiving, right? Everybody wants to watch the news. So you know I'm dangerous. And you know I'm running from someone worse than the police. He didn't have a visible weapon, but his presence was a weapon. He moved with a coiled tension that screamed danger. Look, I can go out the front and tell everyone I saw nothing. You can hide until morning. Just let me go, I pleaded. He shook his head. Can't risk it. You tell someone, they find me. But I'm not here for you. I told you. I'm here for him. He knows this place. He told me he'd be waiting for me here. The bastard. Who? Who is waiting for you? He ignored the question. He snatched a heavy chef's knife off the magnetic strip above the prep table. You're going to hide me. If he shows up, you tell him I never came in this building. You tell him you saw a man matching my description run north down the alley. You understand. You will be my cover story. My breath hitched. I was now a participant. A shield. He forced me into the small, cramped janitor's closet near the walk-in freezer. It smelled intensely of bleach and pine cleaner. "Stay quiet. Don't move. If I hear one sound, I'll assume it's him and I'll act accordingly." He slammed the door shut. I heard the click of the heavy key turning in the lock. I was trapped, alone in the dark, breathing the toxic fumes of cleaning supplies. I pressed my ear against the cold wood. I could hear him moving around the kitchen. He was barricading the delivery door. Minutes later, I heard the main kitchen door, the one leading to the office, open. "Mrs. Henderson, is that you? I'm still here. I was just finishing up," I whispered, trying to sound normal, trying to let someone know I was locked in. The man, the fugitive, hissed loudly, "Shut up, or you die right now." I froze. Then, I heard a different voice, low, smooth, and chillingly polite. "No, dear. Not Mrs. Henderson. She's in the office, counting her pennies. I'm looking for Silas. Did you happen to see my friend Silas? He promised me he'd meet me here for a nice holiday chat." The second man, the one the fugitive was running from. He had a refined, educated voice, entirely out of place in a deserted soup kitchen. Who was this man, and what was his relationship with the fugitive? The fugitive Silas didn't answer. He was silent. "Silas, you know I can smell you. It's Thanksgiving. You should be grateful I took care of your debts, but you stole the ledger. I need the ledger, Silas. And I'm getting very cold." I heard a sudden, violent crash. It sounded like the steel prep table being overturned. Then the sound of a struggle. Hard breathing, grunts, and the scraping of metal on tile. My heart was hammering against my ribs. This was a professional hit, not a random encounter. I had to get out. If one of them won, I was next. I scanned the tiny closet. Above the mop sink was a small wooden shelf. On it were bottles of industrial solvent, rags, and a full box of emergency flare matches. I grabbed the matchbox. I was going to use fire. A terrible idea, but my only one. I quickly struck 3 matches, cupping them in my hand to shield the flame. I reached down and touched the flame to the thin, old, newspaper-stuffed insulation around the pipe leading out of the sink. It didn't catch. The insulation was damp. The banging outside stopped. The silence returned, heavy and awful. Then I heard the smooth voice, right outside the closet door. "Silas ran. He's such a coward. He must have told you to run, too. But I have a much better idea. You can tell me where the ledger is." I heard the man fiddling with the keyhole. He was trying to pick the lock. It was only a matter of seconds. I looked around desperately. The shelves. I grabbed the large, clear plastic bottle of industrial-strength oven cleaner. It was highly corrosive. As the lock finally began to click, I uncapped the bottle and shoved the nozzle through the gap under the door. The moment the lock turned and the door started to open, I squeezed the trigger, spraying a caustic stream of the powerful cleaner directly at the height of a man's face. There was a guttural shout of pain and pure shock. The man stumbled back, dropping something heavy onto the floor. I burst out of the closet, coughing violently from the fumes. The man was clutching his face, screaming, his expensive overcoat soaked in the powerful chemical. I ran blindly through the kitchen. Silas was gone. The delivery door was blocked by the overturned steel table. My only escape was the main door leading to the office. I sprinted toward the office door. I reached the handle. Locked. I smashed the thick glass panel of the door with my elbow. The pain was blinding, but I didn't stop. I reached through the jagged opening and flipped the internal deadlock. I burst into the office. Mrs. Henderson and the 2 other volunteers looked up in shock. "Call 911. Now, there's a dangerous man in the kitchen. He's blind. He's armed." I gasped, pointing back toward the dark kitchen. I didn't wait. I ran past them toward the front of the building. Mrs. Henderson was already dialing. I ran through the deserted, echoing dining hall. I grabbed my coat and purse from the volunteer coat rack near the front. I threw myself out the main front door and into the street. The cold air hit my face, shocking me into clarity. I heard a faint, desperate scream of rage from the back of the building. I ran down the sidewalk until I reached the corner where the streetlights were bright and functioning. I flagged down a passing taxi, screaming at the driver to take me as far away as possible. I escaped the crossfire. I escaped the ledger. I escaped the kindness that nearly killed me. I spent that Thanksgiving night in a hospital, getting stitches in my arm. Story 6. The rental listing had used words like rustic charm and quietly secluded, which, in retrospect, were perfect, flowery euphemisms for isolated death trap and smells overwhelmingly of chemicals and dried blood. It was Thanksgiving weekend, and 6 of us, old college friends, had rented an antique farmhouse deep in the Appalachian foothills for a friendsgiving escape, intending to spend 4 days cooking, drinking too much cider, and pretending our adult lives weren't slowly crushing us. We arrived late Thursday afternoon, the sky already turning that bruised purple color that signals a truly cold night. The farmhouse itself was large and oddly silent, built from dark, heavy timbers, with vast, sloping lawns that bled into an unnerving stretch of dense pine forest. The interior was the first major red flag, although we were all too cheerful and slightly drunk on the journey to notice properly. Every single room, from the mantelpieces to the dim, sprawling hallways, was crammed with taxidermy. Staring glass eyes followed us everywhere. Deer, foxes, a massive, snarling bear in the entryway, and countless birds frozen mid-flight, all clearly the work of a professional. The owner, a reclusive man named Mr. Graves, had left us a curt note about firewood and a single rule: do not, under any circumstances, enter the detached workshop behind the barn. It is strictly private. Naturally, this note only served to solidify our immediate curiosity and unease, especially given the bizarre, overwhelming inventory of mounted wildlife already occupying the main house. We spent the evening preparing the feast, the atmosphere growing increasingly unsettling as the house seemed to groan and settle around us. Around 11 p.m., after everyone was stuffed and dozing near the fire, my friend Sarah, who had a terrible habit of breaking all rules, nudged me and whispered, "I swear I heard a noise from the workshop, a scraping sound, and that weird chemical smell is much stronger tonight." I dismissed it, blaming the wine and the remote setting, but as I volunteered to take a final walk outside to bring in more logs, I realized the air was genuinely thick with a noxious, vaguely metallic odor that definitely wasn't pine or wood smoke. I walked around the massive, dark barn, my breath clouding rapidly in the freezing air, my old nerves beginning to prickle violently. The owner's workshop was a smaller, windowless structure 20 yards away, painted a faded, peeling red. As I approached the workshop, the air grew sickly sweet, and I saw a thin line of pale yellow light escaping from beneath the heavy steel door, which seemed to contradict the owner's note that it was strictly private and should remain untouched. If the workshop was off limits, why was someone clearly working inside this late on Thanksgiving night? I crept closer, pressing my ear against the cold metal door. I heard a series of delicate, meticulous sounds. The faint snip of tiny scissors, the gentle tink of metal tools being placed on a counter, and then a low, unnerving, almost musical humming. It sounded like someone was performing surgery, not mounting a dead animal. The meticulous, calm rhythm of the work was far more frightening than any sudden noise would have been. I backed away quickly, suddenly certain that whatever was happening in that shed was far more disturbing than amateur taxidermy. I rushed back into the warm, cluttered farmhouse, feeling a genuine, heavy dread settle over me, and found Sarah still awake near the cooling embers of the fire. "We need to leave, Sarah. Now, that man isn't just mounting squirrels. There's something horribly wrong out there, and I don't feel safe staying another hour in this remote place," I urged, trying to keep my voice low and steady so as not to wake the others. Sarah, however, was already distracted, staring intently at a massive, antique birdcage tucked into a shadowy corner near the dining room. "Wait, look at this. I just noticed it when the fire died down. That bird, the huge gold one. It doesn't look like any bird I've ever seen, and the feathers look too shiny, almost like plastic." We crept closer to the cage. The bird was indeed a terrifying masterpiece. Huge, with brilliant yellow plumage, but when I leaned in close and flicked one of the tail feathers, it didn't feel like a feather at all. It felt stiff, like incredibly brittle, treated hair. And then I saw the truth, the tiny, horrific detail that brought everything crashing down. The eyes weren't glass, but dull, cloudy human eyes, placed with chilling precision. The stomach-churning realization was instantaneous and devastating. Mr. Graves wasn't just a taxidermist of animals. He was collecting human specimens, and the harvest we had heard about in the owner's note was something far more terrifying than a field of corn. We were surrounded by the carefully preserved, silent remnants of previous guests, previous friendsgivings. Before we could even scream, the back door of the kitchen burst open violently, and Mr. Graves stood framed in the sudden light, wiping his hands on a filthy rag, his pale eyes glittering with horrifying satisfaction. He had discarded the curt homeowner persona, and his expression was now utterly predatory. Such a shame you two decided to wake up early. The others are sleeping so soundly, waiting to be properly cleaned. I see you found my little canary. Were you not satisfied with the turkey and needed to peek at the dessert? He moved with the unnerving, practiced silence of a hunter, holding a long, wicked-looking skinning knife that looked terrifyingly sharp, the blade catching the dim light of the hall. We bolted, scrambling up the narrow, dark staircase, knowing the thick walls of the house offered no real protection, only temporary evasion. We split up on the second floor. Sarah ran toward the front bedrooms, and I threw myself into the first door I saw, which was a tiny, unused linen closet at the end of the hall. I pressed myself deep among the moth-eaten blankets, listening to the heavy, deliberate footsteps moving slowly along the hallway floorboards. He wasn't running, he was savoring the hunt. I heard him pause outside the bedroom Sarah had entered. Silence. Then, a muffled, sharp, sickening thump followed by a small, choked sound. My blood ran cold, and the reality of my desperate situation hit me with overwhelming force. I knew I couldn't stay in the linen closet. It was a transparent and temporary hiding spot. I had to escape the house entirely and get out into the pitch-black forest, which, though terrifying, felt safer than the owner's custom-built trophy room. I crept out of the closet and sprinted silently toward the back of the house, where I knew there was a rickety fire escape attached to the master bedroom balcony. I reached the master bedroom door, which was thankfully unlocked, and slipped inside, moving past the imposing, four-poster bed. The balcony doors were heavy glass, also locked from the inside with a small brass lever. I fumbled with the cold metal, my hands shaking so badly that the brass lock rattled loudly in the otherwise perfect silence. Would the sound alert him to my exact position? Suddenly, the bedroom door flew open, hitting the wall with a deafening crash, and Mr. Graves stood there, his face now contorted with furious impatience, the skinning knife held low and ready. Such a struggle. You're spoiling the beautiful process. I was going to give you a lovely placement near the window, a nice, serene pose. I smashed my elbow against the weakest point of the old glass doors, shattering the pane and sending jagged shards scattering across the balcony floor, creating an immediate, painful path to freedom. I scrambled over the edge, feeling the sharp points of broken glass slice through my skin, and launched myself onto the rusting metal rungs of the fire escape. The metal ladder shrieked and groaned under my weight, a truly terrible sound that must have echoed across the isolated valley. I slid down the rungs, ignoring the burning pain in my palms, until I reached the overgrown grass below. I didn't stop to look back. I ran headlong into the darkness of the pine forest, tripping over roots and tearing through thick, thorny brush. I ran until I collapsed, gasping for breath, deep in the absolute, silent blackness of the woods, far from the light of the house. Hours later, freezing and near hypothermia, I staggered onto a remote paved road and flagged down a passing emergency services vehicle responding to a regional power outage. They found the farmhouse, the silent figures inside, and the cold, empty birdcage. I escaped the collection. But the quiet perfection of a mounted trophy will forever haunt my memory of that Friendsgiving night. Story 7. The air in the industrial park, even on Thanksgiving night, was thick with the cold smell of diesel fumes and forgotten potential, which felt perfectly fitting for a holiday I was spending alone and mandated to work. My job as a courier for Rapid Route Logistics meant that Thanksgiving was not a day of rest, but a prime time for mandatory overtime, pushing out last-minute corporate packages and, tonight, the specialized, high-priority cargo that absolutely could not wait until Black Friday. My last delivery was the worst one, located deep within the abandoned, sprawling mess of the old Northwood industrial zone, an area notorious for being dark, labyrinthine, and utterly deserted after sundown. It was 1:30 a.m. when my battered company van rattled its way down the access road toward Warehouse 17, a vast, low-slung structure with most of its windows broken out and its loading bay doors perpetually rusted shut. I had a single, heavy, unmarked metal case to deliver to a name I didn't recognize, at an address that looked more like a derelict movie set than an active business location. My dispatcher had been extremely vague, only repeating that the client was very important and that I should not ask any questions about the contents of the case, a warning that already had my internal alarm bells ringing loudly. I pulled the van up to the only discernible entrance, a small side door marked with peeling yellow caution tape, and cut the engine. The sudden silence was immediate and oppressive, broken only by the distant, high-pitched whine of an unsecured alarm somewhere far down the complex. I grabbed the metal case. It weighed a good 40 pounds and felt disconcertingly solid, and fumbled with the tiny keypad next to the door, inputting the temporary code my dispatcher had provided. The door clicked open with a harsh, metallic sound, revealing a space that was even darker than the outside, smelling intensely of old concrete, dust, and something metallic, like burnt wiring. "Hello, delivery. Rapid Route Logistics," I called out, my voice swallowed immediately by the cavernous interior of the warehouse. There was no answer, but I heard a faint, rhythmic thump-thump sound echoing from somewhere far in the back, slow and steady, like someone methodically dropping a heavy sack. I stepped inside, pulling out the weak LED flashlight from my belt, its beam barely cutting through the gloom, making the towering stacks of empty pallets and tarpaulin-covered objects look like massive, lurking figures. This felt wrong, deeply and dangerously wrong. A legitimate client would have lights on, security, and someone waiting. Was this a handover or was it a setup? And why would anyone choose this abandoned warehouse for a high-priority delivery on a freezing Thanksgiving night? I moved cautiously down the central aisle, the sound of the heavy thump-thump growing louder, guiding me deeper into the oppressive darkness. As I rounded a corner near a stack of enormous, silent machinery, the single, harsh beam of my flashlight revealed something truly sickening, forcing an involuntary gasp that felt like liquid ice in my throat. There were 3 men, none of whom were expecting a courier, huddled together in a circle beneath a single, dim utility light bulb strung precariously from the ceiling. 2 men were restraining a third, who was clearly injured, his face slick with sweat and something dark. The rhythmic thump I had been hearing wasn't a sack dropping, but the sound of the third man being repeatedly and brutally hit with a heavy length of rubber hose. They were conducting a violent, private interrogation. My sudden appearance froze the entire horrific tableau. The 2 restraining men immediately stopped their work and snapped their heads toward me, their faces grim and cold, their hands still gripping the victim's jacket. The man with the hose, who was large, wearing a dark leather jacket, dropped the hose and slowly reached inside his coat. "Who the hell is that? You shouldn't be here," the man in the leather jacket growled, his voice low and dangerous, instantly establishing himself as the person in charge. I held up the heavy metal case, the only rational thing I could think to do. "I'm the courier, Rapid Route. I was told to deliver this to Warehouse 17. I apologize. I must have the wrong time." I tried to sound apologetic, professional, and utterly unintelligent, hoping they would dismiss me as a harmless, clueless drone. The leader stepped toward me, his eyes never leaving the case. "Give me the box. Now, and then you forget you ever saw this place. Forget the number 17, forget the holiday, and you drive that little van of yours right back to the city without stopping for anything." Do you understand the consequences of a bad memory? I handed him the case, my hands shaking violently as I released the weight. He took it, his face flickering with a moment of predatory satisfaction. I started backing away, slowly, toward the side door, desperate to just disappear into the dark aisles. But before I could get 10 feet, the injured man they were holding suddenly broke free with a desperate burst of adrenaline. He stumbled toward me, his eyes wide with desperate recognition. That's it, the transit case. They're the ones. Call the police. They're killing me for the access code. The leader instantly lunged, not at the escapee, but toward me, realizing I was a dangerous, unexpected witness. I didn't wait to see the weapon he drew. I spun and ran back the way I came, my flashlight bouncing uselessly on the floor. I sprinted back toward the small side door, hearing the heavy, purposeful boots of the two restraining men pounding the concrete floor behind me. Their pursuit immediate and lethal. I reached the entrance door and threw myself against it, fumbling for the lock. It was a heavy, industrial steel door, requiring the code from the outside to lock, but I couldn't remember if it had a simple internal deadbolt. My terrified hands slid uselessly over the smooth metal. I heard the leader scream from the back, "Lock the service tunnels. Find the van keys. Don't let her leave this building." She saw everything. I finally found the heavy steel bar that served as the internal push-to-exit lock, and I slammed it open, bursting out into the freezing night air. I didn't head for my van, realizing it was now a trap. They would simply block it in or use it as bait. I ran past the van and deeper into the network of dark, interconnected loading docks and abandoned shipping containers. I was fast, but they were relentless, their powerful flashlights slicing through the darkness, illuminating the uneven ground just meters behind me. I dove between two massive, rusty shipping containers, squeezing myself into the narrow, suffocating gap, the rough metal scraping against my skin. I held my breath, listening as their footsteps grew closer, passing right by my hiding spot. She went toward the back fence. "Split up. You go around the west side. I'll take the center access road. She can't get out of the complex. It's a dead end." The leader commanded, his voice muffled by the metal walls. I waited until their footsteps had faded into the distance. I knew the geography of this place from my delivery routes. There was only one way out on foot that didn't involve scaling a barbed wire fence, the drainage culvert that ran beneath the main access road, usually covered by a heavy metal grate. I crawled out from between the containers, my clothes stained with rust and grease, and moved silently toward the sound of rushing, icy water. I found the culvert opening, dark, wet, and smelling of mold. The metal grate was massive, easily 300 pounds. I braced my shoulder against the cold steel of the grate. I pushed, straining every muscle in my body. It didn't budge. It was held fast by corrosion and its own immense weight. I heard the faint, terrifying sound of the men circling back, their shouts echoing closer. They knew I was somewhere near the perimeter. I looked around frantically for a tool. Nothing. Then I remembered the only object of any weight I had left. I yanked off my heavy, thick work boot, its steel toe a solid, blunt weapon. I shoved the toe of the boot under the edge of the grate, using the solid steel as a makeshift lever. I pushed down on the heel, putting all my body weight into the leverage. The rusted grate lifted just enough to expose a terrifying, dark opening. I kicked the boot off and threw myself onto my stomach, slithering into the wet, cold concrete of the tunnel beneath the heavy grate. As I squeezed my legs through the final opening, I heard the men reach the culvert. "She's in the drain pipe. She's trying to crawl out. Pull the grate." One of them yelled. I heard their furious grunts as they attempted to lift the huge grate, but I was already moving, scrambling through the filth-choked, dark tunnel, the noise of their effort fading behind me. I kept crawling through the icy, disgusting muck until I saw the tiny, hopeful circle of light at the far end of the culvert. I finally burst out into a snowy, empty field on the other side of the industrial park, emerging onto a quiet, residential street far from the abandoned warehouse. I ran toward the first house with lights on, throwing myself against the porch door and screaming for help. I escaped the mandatory delivery and the horrifying secret it contained. Story 8. Working retail on Thanksgiving night is a uniquely soul-crushing experience. A strange mix of forced holiday cheer during the day and frantic, militaristic preparation for the Black Friday stampede once the doors finally lock. I was a shift supervisor at the Emporium, a high-end clothing store in the massive, echoing Willowbrook Mall, and my job was to stay until 3 a.m., setting up the intricate sale displays and security sensor strips, long after the last shopper had been herded out by the tired security staff. It was 1:45 a.m., and the mall was a colossal tomb of polished marble and darkened glass, silent except for the low, omnipresent thrum of the ventilation system and the distant, tinny music piped in for the cleaning crew, a muffled, bizarre rendition of holiday jazz. My 2 remaining coworkers had finished their tasks and clocked out, leaving me entirely alone to complete the final, most tedious security check of the sprawling store, ensuring every mannequin was in place and every cash register was completely secured. I was in the far back corner of our stockroom, wrestling with a stubborn box of security tags, when the overhead fluorescent lights in the main store suddenly snapped off, plunging the space into a deep, unsettling gloom broken only by the thin, emergency red glow filtering from the mall corridors. This was unusual. The mall security always kept the main store aisles dimly lit during these overnight shifts for safety and monitoring purposes. Had someone simply flipped a switch, or was this a deliberate, unsettling choice by an unknown party? I grabbed my phone, its weak battery percentage causing immediate anxiety, and activated the flashlight app, its narrow beam casting long, dancing shadows that made the racks of clothing look like silent, waiting people. I carefully made my way to the back stockroom door, which opened onto the mall service corridor, intending to call the mall's centralized security office from a landline, but the heavy door was now sealed shut with an internal, industrial-grade drop bar, a bar that was never, ever engaged while staff were inside the building. A sudden, chilling realization hit me. The entire mall was locked down, and someone or something had engaged the emergency lockdown protocol, trapping me inside my store, within this enormous, dark labyrinth of consumerism. I heard it then, a noise that immediately crystallized my fear into pure, paralyzing terror. The distinct sound of heavy, booted footsteps scraping slowly along the highly polished tile floor of the main mall corridor, moving with unnerving deliberation directly past my darkened storefront. It wasn't the hurried gait of a cleaning worker or the bored shuffle of a late-night security guard. It was slow, heavy, and methodical, the pace of a predator stalking its prey. I crept to the glass storefront, pressing my face against the chilled surface, trying to peer through the narrow gaps between the heavy display curtains. I saw a fleeting shape, a man, tall and bulky, wearing dark, heavy clothing and carrying something long and metallic that glinted briefly in the emergency light. He paused directly in front of my store, turning his head slowly, and in that agonizing moment, I knew with absolute certainty that he was looking right at me, sensing my presence despite the darkness. How did he know I was still here, and what was his purpose in patrolling the locked corridors of the mall on a night dedicated to consumer frenzy? I backed away silently, stumbling over a mannequin's detached arm, sending a quiet thud echoing into the cavernous silence of the store. I held my breath, listening, and heard the footsteps outside stop instantly, followed by a slow, deliberate movement as the man turned to face my store's heavy, double-locked entrance. I knew the front doors were steel-reinforced and would hold for a short time, but the store also had a second weakness. A small, seldom-used service hatch in the back stockroom that led to the utility access tunnels and, eventually, to the main mall's air conditioning vents. It was a filthy, claustrophobic route, but it was my only chance to leave the store and find a way out of the sealed building. I raced back to the stockroom, throwing aside boxes and mannequins in my desperate scramble to reach the steel hatch hidden behind a stack of damaged clothes. I wrestled with the heavy circular hatch, using a discarded metal hanger to pry the stiff lock, my fingers cramping with strain, until the door finally gave way with a screech of rusty hinges. I squeezed through the tight opening, pulling the heavy hatch shut behind me, plunging myself into the absolute, suffocating darkness and dust of the maintenance tunnels. The air immediately became thick and stale, smelling powerfully of stale oil and decaying materials, forcing me to breathe in shallow, terrified gasps. I started to crawl, using my phone's flashlight to guide me through the narrow, concrete-lined passage, heading blindly toward the theoretical center of the mall where the main ventilation shafts were located. I could still hear the faint, horrifying sound of the man trying to force the steel door of my store, a heavy, rhythmic bang that seemed to shake the very structure of the mall. After what felt like hours of agonizing, dust-choked crawling, I reached the vertical shaft, a series of narrow metal rungs ascending into a huge, dark cavern that was the main air intake chamber. I started to climb, each rung cold and slippery beneath my hands, knowing that one slip would send me plummeting into the unseen depths of the shaft. As I reached the top platform, which provided a terrifying view down the dark, echoing tunnel of the main vent, I heard a sound from below that made my blood run cold. The dull, unmistakable scrape of the maintenance tunnel hatch being opened, followed by the blinding beam of a powerful flashlight cutting through the dust. Was he already following me, or was he simply checking all known escape routes within the building? I didn't hesitate. I scrambled onto the narrow, slippery metal lip of the main air duct, pulling myself forward into the horizontal tunnel, crawling now not for escape, but for silence. I could hear his shouts from the tunnel below, muffled but full of chilling, focused rage. "I know you're in the vents. The cleaning crew told me one of you was always afraid of the dark. You can't hide up there forever." He knew the building intimately. He wasn't just a trespasser. He was a sentinel. I crawled for what seemed like an impossible distance, the air growing colder and colder, until I felt a strong rush of frigid outside air, signaling an external vent opening. I reached a huge, rotating fan that thankfully wasn't moving, and beside it, a large access panel covered by a heavy wire mesh, leading directly to the mall's roof. I frantically searched for a way to open the mesh. My hands were useless, slick with sweat and grime. I finally found a thick, discarded piece of metal wire left by a maintenance worker, and I jammed it into the hinge of the mesh panel, twisting it with desperate, final strength. The wire snapped, but the rusted hinge buckled, allowing me just enough space to squeeze through. I pushed myself through the gap and tumbled out onto the vast, flat, freezing roof of the mall, the wide, open sky and the distant city lights offering a terrifying sense of freedom. I stood up, shivering violently, and ran to the edge, looking down. The mall roof was 3 stories high, far too great a drop, but nearby, I saw the only vehicle that was ever parked on the roof. The security company's armored van, used for cash transport and usually secured by a flimsy chain-link fence. I sprinted toward the van, scaled the low fence easily, and smashed the driver's side window with the only heavy object I had, a large piece of loose, frozen cinder block I found near the air unit. I reached inside, frantically searched the console, and found the keys exactly where the bored security guards always left them. I started the heavy van, slammed it into gear, and drove the huge vehicle toward the single, chained-off access ramp that led down to the ground level, using the sheer weight of the armored vehicle to deliberately snap the thick metal chain. I heard the distant, furious shriek of the sentinel below as I crashed through the final gate and sped out onto the deserted highway, leaving the vast, echoing tomb of the mall behind me forever. Story 9. House-sitting for the incredibly wealthy is always an exercise in surreal absurdity, but doing it over the Thanksgiving holiday, alone in a sprawling penthouse that felt more like a climate-controlled museum, amplified the sense of detachment and profound isolation. My clients, the Ashworths, were jet-setting in Bali, leaving me in charge of their 3-story luxury condominium high above the city, with a list of instructions that included feeding their exotic fish and, most importantly, never touching the large, abstract steel sculpture in the library, which I suspected was far more than just contemporary art. It was 11:30 p.m. on Thanksgiving night, and after a solitary, pathetic meal of microwaved leftovers I brought from home, I was settling down in the massive main living area, watching the distant city lights sparkle like scattered diamonds below me, when the power flickered violently, not just a casual dip, but a hard, instantaneous surge that killed the lights and the internet connection instantly. This was deeply unsettling. The building had redundant power systems, and a complete outage this high up was virtually impossible, making the silence that immediately followed feel unnaturally heavy and deeply wrong. I fumbled for the flashlight on my phone, cursing the low battery, and made my way to the wall console to check the internal breakers. But before I could reach it, a different kind of sound replaced the silence. The faint, repetitive chirp click of the security system being methodically bypassed at the main entrance downstairs, a sound that should have been impossible given the heavy, biometric security the building maintained. Who was skilled enough to defeat the Ashworths' elaborate defense system, and why would they choose a holiday night to attempt a high-stakes robbery on the most secured unit in the entire building? I knew the Ashworths were involved in something shadowy, perhaps high-level financial crime, perhaps something worse, because their instructions had included a very specific, chilling protocol. In the event of an unannounced breach, proceed immediately to the panic room and engage the lockdown. Procedure. The panic room was concealed behind that massive, abstract steel sculpture in the library. I ran through the dark, echoing hallways, my heart pounding against my ribs, until I reached the library, the air suddenly thick with a palpable tension. I found the sculpture, a cold, geometric monolith, and pressed the hidden switch behind a specific, cold metallic edge, just as the Ashworths had instructed me to do during our brief, uneasy orientation. With a deep, pneumatic hiss, the massive sculpture slid silently into the wall, revealing a thick, gray steel vault door and a small keypad. I entered the simple 4-digit code I had memorized. The door swung open, and I threw myself inside, slamming the heavy door shut and twisting the large, ship-will locking mechanism with frantic haste. The click of the final bolt sliding into place was the most reassuring sound I had ever heard. I was safe, theoretically, in a windowless steel box with a dedicated air supply and a single low-powered emergency light. But as I leaned against the cold wall, trying to catch my breath, I heard the footsteps. They weren't frantic or clumsy. They were slow, professional, and entirely confident, moving with the terrifying certainty of people who knew exactly where they were going and exactly what they were looking for. The footsteps paused right outside the library. I heard a smooth, cultured voice, entirely calm and completely devoid of emotion, speaking softly in a language I recognized as a precise, formal variant of Russian. The asset is not in the master bedroom. Check the safe room protocol. They are predictably cowardly, and the room will contain the primary target and any witness. We will retrieve the ledger. The ledger. That was what the man Silas was running from in the last story. Now it was the primary target of these highly professional intruders. Were the Ashworths involved in the same network, and what was in that cursed book that made people risk everything on Thanksgiving night? The Russian voice grew closer, muffled now by the steel door. There is no use in hiding, girl. We know the room's location and we have the schematics. It will only take a few minutes to access the internal fuse box and initiate the thermal plasma cutter. Save us the time and open the door. It is only a matter of when, not if. My terror gave way to cold, desperate logic. The room was impenetrable for a short time, but the Ashworths had mentioned one critical vulnerability: the emergency satellite uplink device, a bulky black box hidden behind a removable wall panel that served as the room's only external communication link, designed to override the building's jamming technology. I found the panel and yanked it open, revealing the black box and a thick cable running from it. I flipped the power switch on the box, but the small status light remained dark. The power outage was complete, even to this emergency equipment. My only lifeline was dead. I looked around the small room desperately. It contained a medical kit, a few bottles of water, and a heavy-duty, rechargeable work light. I grabbed the light and turned it on, the beam illuminating the bare steel walls and, most importantly, a small, recessed panel near the floor, labeled Air Filtration Maintenance. I heard the terrible, high-pitched whine begin outside the door, the sound of the thermal cutter preparing to burn through the steel. I had maybe 90 seconds before they breached the door. I used a heavy, sterilized pair of surgical shears from the medical kit to pry open the air filtration panel. Inside was a mass of dust-covered pipes, wires, and, thank God, a single loose, high-voltage copper wire clearly marked secondary ventilation exhaust bypass. My plan was insane, but my time was up. I grabbed the heavy, rechargeable work light and found the internal battery access panel. I knew from years of minor household repair that these batteries held a massive charge. I quickly stripped the plastic insulation from the copper wire I had found, exposing the raw metal. The cutting noise outside was now a deafening, continuous scream, and I could hear the faint, sickening smell of melting steel beginning to seep through the seams of the door. I wrapped one end of the stripped copper wire around the positive terminal of the work light's exposed battery. The other end I quickly jammed into the small, metallic gap around the panic room's external keypad, which was now melting and smoking from the heat of the cutter. Would this massive electrical surge be enough to short the thermal cutter, or would it simply overload the internal circuits and kill me? I pushed the wire hard against the melting metal. There was a brilliant, blinding blue flash inside the panic room, followed by a deafening, violent crack shock from the other side of the steel door. The high-pitched whine of the plasma cutter died instantly, replaced by the guttural shouts and curses of the intruders. I had overloaded their expensive equipment, likely electrocuting the man holding the cutter. I had bought myself a precious few minutes of pure silence. I didn't wait. I knew the door, though compromised, would hold for a while longer. I grabbed the only heavy metal object I could find, the large, solid steel arm from the wheel lock mechanism I had just used, and smashed the maintenance panel door I had pried open. I wedged the metal arm into the opening, using it to snap the flimsy piping and create a larger gap. I squeezed through the opening into the ventilation shaft, pulling the panel mostly closed behind me. I was now in the main exhaust shaft of the penthouse, a steep, dusty decline that dropped several stories. I used the sharp metal edges and the internal brackets of the shaft as handholds, slowly descending into the dark, cold depths of the building's ventilation system. I crawled for what felt like miles, until the shaft leveled out and I found an old, access panel that looked like it led to a ground-floor utility room. I kicked the panel repeatedly with my heel until the old metal gave way, dropping me onto a pile of cleaning supplies in a deserted, ground-floor laundry room. I ran out of the laundry room and into the main lobby, which was dark and abandoned, the power outage affecting the entire lower half of the building. I didn't wait for the elevators or the stairwell. I ran out the shattered side door, which the intruders had clearly bypassed and damaged, and sprinted down the street, finding safety when I flagged down a passing emergency vehicle that was slowly navigating the blackout area. I escaped the luxurious trap and the dangerous secrets of the ledger, but I will never look at a steel sculpture or a simple power outage the same way again.